When I stepped out of the car on moving day, I felt like the queen of Sycamore Hills, my regal colonial home standing tall behind me. The freshly cut lawns glimmered like emerald carpets in the golden afternoon sun, pastel-colored houses lined up like a cheerful army, ready to welcome me into the fold. This is it, I thought, my gardening glove-clad hands trembling with anticipation. Fast forward 3 years, and my dream had manifested into a vibrant carnival of colors, butterflies, and of course, my beloved garden gnomes, 10 in total. Each little ceramic fellow had a personality popping like balloons at a birthday party. There was Bob, the bashful one, who always looked a tad embarrassed in his awkward pose, and Gertrude, the sassy diva with a flower necklace so ostentatious it could make a peacock green with envy. "Oh look, it's the gnome lady." I could hear neighbors chuckling as they wandered by, kids pointing and squealing. "There's another gnome," they'd scream in delight, racing each other to count how many new ones I added that season. I found immense joy in the fact that I had somehow become the unofficial entertainment for the neighborhood kids. Simple pleasures, my friends. But let me tell you, the real charm of Sycamore Hills came from the previous HOA board. They were like the friendly ghosts in my garden, the kind that only popped in when the weeds threatened to take over the entire neighborhood. They kept everything looking pristine without suffocating us with a million rules. We could breathe. Who needed a new rule dictating the exact angle your flower beds should be? I had learned the rhythm of this community. Morning garden watering sessions, afternoon chats with Mrs. Peterson about her impressive rose bushes, and evenings spent in my yard, gnomes standing sentinel as I watched the sunset. Life was delightfully predictable, a refreshing detox from the chaos of the outside world. But of course, all good things must encounter a turbulent wave, and that wave swelled the moment I received my first notification from the newly appointed HOA board. The previous team had voted out, and with it, the winds of change blew in with a heavy-handed gripe about community aesthetic. As I perused the elegantly crafted letter that practically dripped with passive aggression, I felt a storm brewing in my stomach. "Dear resident," it began with a sickly sweet tone, "we wish to remind you that your unique display of garden gnomes may be perceived as a disruption to the overall aesthetic of our lovely Sycamore Hills." I couldn't help but snicker, my gnomes disrupting. All they did was hang out in their quirky poses, smiling benignly despite the growing anxiety bubbling within me. Karen Stankovic, my next-door neighbor and notorious self-appointed lawn police, had made a grand return to the HOA, and I just knew this was all her doing. With a heavy sigh, I set the letter down, choking on that bitter mix of disbelief and indignation. Oh, it was on. If they thought they could just waltz in and dictate my garden gnome fashion show, they had another thing coming. The battle for my floral kingdom was about to begin, and I wasn't going down without a wickedly whimsical fight. The suburban utopia of Oakwood Heights, where the lawns are cut to military precision and pastel-painted houses stand in proud formation, whispering sweet mischief beneath their synchronized eaves. Picture this: every morning as the sun breaks, you can almost hear the harmonious sound of leaf blowers and the chirping of birds, far outshone by the more regal symphony of the Winthrop clan, where Marjorie reigns supreme. As for me, I'm the proud owner of a prideful collection of gnomes that I affectionately refer to as my little garden guardians. Yeah, sure, they're technically tacky lawn ornaments according to Marjorie, but in my mind, they provide essential color, character, and a certain je ne sais quoi that is naturally absent from her sterile flower beds. My gnomes have welcomed neighbors into my slice of paradise for years, offering blind-eyed smiles and courageous poses straight out of a child's imagination, and a few questionable yard sales. But back to the day it all changed. I was blissfully watering my daisies when in the post came the most dastardly of documents. It was no postcard filled with sunshine and rainbows. Oh no, it was a violation notice stuck to my mailbox like a vendetta. Tacky lawn ornaments, it read, waving the HOA rulebook like a bright red flag. I had 72 hours to remove each and every last gnome, or risk, gulp, fines so steep they could pay for an entire year's worth of organic kale at the farmer's market. Under normal circumstances, I would have laughed it off, maybe even sent a gnome their way for good measure. but for some reason, today I felt audacious enough to confront the queen bee herself. So I marched towards the community tennis court where I found her regally perched on a bench, kicking her white sneakers against the silver net. "Marjorie," I called out, my voice dripping with determination. She turned, eyes hidden behind this oversized pair of designer sunglasses that screamed, "I can't even." Instantly regretting my decision, I thought, "Great, where's my backup?" "Oh, hello," she chirped, plastering on a saccharine smile that could only mean something obnoxiously passive-aggressive was coming. "I see you received my little reminder." "Reminder? Maury like a declaration of war," I shot back, my hands gesturing towards my beloved gnome brigade. "They are art, Marjorie, decorative masterpieces. You think they're tacky? Well, I think your plastic flamingos are an affront to taste." "Oh, sweetie, but that's just quintessential Florida charm," she cooed, adjusting her shades with the kind of confidence only a small-town tyrant can muster. "These gnomes, or whatever you call them, simply lower property values. Cherish your childlike wonder while you can. It might just land you in the poorhouse." My heart cried out, and what if I like living in a poorhouse filled with personality? But instead, I swallowed hard and tried to reason with her. Will my dying gnome army really lead us down a slippery slope towards a neighborhood of hedge mazes and beige? With that, Miss Winthrop lifted her chin and strutted away, her perfectly pressed tennis whites flapping in the wind, no doubt on a mission to school someone as innocent as a neighbor's newborn puppy about HOA rule violation, leaving me with a mess of emotions. As I watched her disappear, clad in the kind of self-satisfaction that only comes when wielding power against unsuspecting victims like me, I knew I was in for one hell of a fight. And so it began, the great gnome conflict of Oakwood Heights. Game on, Marjorie, game on. I had always prided myself on being a good neighbor. I waved cheerfully at everyone, offered to help carry groceries, and even participated in the annual neighborhood cleanup. Little did I know, it was all a facade masking the deep, dark turmoil brewing behind the pristine hedges of our cookie-cutter suburb. It all started with my infamous garden gnome collection. You know, the cute little guys with goofy smiles, holding their fishing rods and shovels, just welcoming all who passed by. Honestly, they were practically iconic in our neighborhood. But then there was Marjorie. Oh, Marjorie. The self-appointed queen of the HOA, reigning supreme in her pastel pink cape. I mean, cardigan. She glided through our cul-de-sac like a dictator making her daily rounds, clipboard in hand, hair perfectly coiffed like a 1960s TV star. I could practically hear the dramatic organ music play as she plotted her next move against me in my battle of wits. It seems my gnome collection was committing some egregious artistic crime against the pristine nature of suburban etiquette. The day I reluctantly boxed them up marked the beginning of my real descent into the HOA Hades. I tried burying my sorrow in fantasy novels, but even the realms of dragons couldn't lift my spirits once the first violation letter landed in my mailbox. It was as if Marjorie had an evil crystal ball and knew precisely how to manipulate it. "Your grass is 1/4 inch too tall," it read so sweetly, yet with an undercurrent of menace. As if my lawn was a high-stakes poker game, and somehow I was losing badly with a pair of twos. I hardly had time to process that violation when the next letter arrived. Apparently my mailbox paint was faded enough to earn me another reprimand. Faded? Lady, it's called character. But when my garden hose was flagged for not being stored properly, I mean, are we storing garden hoses in a museum? I felt as if my dignity was being slowly strangled by the very rubbery limbs I relied on for watering my precious daisies. Then there was the camel's back with a ticked-off straw Marjorie's measuring tape. Yes, she actually measured the distance between my hedges and the sidewalk. I could picture her crouching down like a creepy lawn gnome herself, grinning as she discovered I was 3 whole inches too close to the public walkway. Did my hedges offend her delicate sensibilities? The fine was steep, and I swear I could hear her snicker from across the street. But here's the plot twist. Right when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Marjorie hosted an HOA meeting in her impossibly immaculate backyard, white tablecloths, light streaming through oaks, and the unmistakable scent of passive aggression wafting in the air. As a crowd gathered over overpriced coffee and organic muffins, the moment of truth arrived. With her eyes sparkling, like a cat eyeing a trapped mouse, she publicly ridiculed my gnome obsession, claiming I needed professional help for my lawn decoration addiction. My heart sank. Afterward, I sat in my living room, clutching the HOA bylaws like they were my life vest. I expected a black-and-white document outlining the rules that justified her bizarre vendetta, only to find her dictatorial decrees were a figment of her ruthless imagination. How delightful! If there were ever a moment to laugh hysterically at my own misfortune, it was this one. I could feel the tension sizzling in the air, and I knew this wasn't over. Morning air was unusually crisp for mid-June, perfumed with fresh grass and the overly saccharine scent of someone's ill-advised lilac hedge. As I brewed a strong cup of coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, mind you, through the window I caught sight of Marjorie. She was there, rear end up in the air, like a disgraced raccoon pouring through trash. Except instead of garbage, she was hovering over my front porch, completely oblivious to the concept of property rights. From my window, I squinted to make sure it wasn't just a caffeine-induced hallucination. There she was, our neighborhood's self-appointed HOA overlord, complete with her tragically shiny bob and that ridiculous scarf, which I was sure she bought at a thrift store to uphold her frugally chic lifestyle. I was minding my own business, sipping coffee in my fuzzy slippers, and suddenly there's Marjorie, practically squatting on my welcome mat, snapping pictures of my one and only garden gnome. Yes, just one. I'd decided to embrace minimalism and placed a solitary gnome, Mervyn, named after my uncle, on my doorstep as a subtle nod to whimsy. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I shouted through the open window. It was a bold move, and I'll admit, a little part of me wanted to see if I could channel my inner superhero. Was Marjorie the villain in my comic book? She barely looked up from her lens, adjusting her oversized sunglasses as if our bright suburban streets were too intense for her delicate disposition. "I'm documenting violations of community standards," she chirped, and I could almost see the smugness radiating off her knitted sweater. "That gnome, it's a breach, dear. You're in violation of Section 3, Subsection B of the HOA bylaws regarding decorative yard ornaments." I blinked. "And your public service project includes photographing my porch. Isn't that a little invasive?" "Invasive," she scoffed. "I prefer to think of it as proactive community engagement." I rolled my eyes so hard I was worried I'd sprained something. If there was a prize for pretentiousness, Marjorie would win it hands down. It was worth a gnome army salute to know that my mysterious porch gnome had garnered such attention. "I'm sorry," I shot back, my voice as steady as my racing heart. "But Mervyn is hardly a decorative yard ornament. He's a cherished family heirloom. Cherished or not, it's not in accordance with HOA standards. I can escalate this, you know. Daily fines, and if compliance doesn't occur, I might even have to put a lien on your property." A lien? What was this, a reality show? I could picture it. The Gnome Wars. Suddenly, I became acutely aware of my gnome collection, accumulated unrepentantly over years and packed away like treasure in the attic. Something snapped inside me. If Marjorie needed to learn about the beauty of garden gnomes, maybe a personal tour was in order. As I watched her, having now set up a tripod for serious Gnome League documentation, I grinned, a plan brewing. After all, if there was one thing I could throw at Karen-esque figures like her, it was a touch of irony. Let's see how she'd handle a veritable gnome renaissance right on her doorstep. With that defiant thought, coffee now forgotten, I plotted my first step out of the shadows and into full gnome glory. Comes a time in every neighborhood where passive-aggressive lawn decorations turn from charming to downright infuriating. For me, that time had arrived, and it was courtesy of Karen. You know, the type of neighbor who has a license plate that reads HOA RULEZ, and who treats her front yard like the set of a low-budget fairy tale, complete with pastel-painted gnomes awkwardly posed like they just stepped out of a 1970s sitcom. Living in Maplewood Pines is usually akin to strolling through a Hallmark movie. Well-maintained lawns are the norm, flowers bloom like neighbors' smiles at HOA meetings, and the air is laced with the scent of freshly cut grass. That is, unless you find yourself under the daily scrutiny of a Karen, dedicated to ensuring that no lawn, no matter how meticulously coiffed, outshines her gnome-riddled oasis. It all started when I spotted her frolicking down the block, her oversized sunglasses perched on her nose like a hawk surveying its territory. I was trying not to break a sweat during my early morning coffee ritual as she hollered across the street, "Darling, are you going to let your weeds take over the entire planet or just your front yard?" And there it was, the moment I knew I had to exact revenge, not through conventional means, but through delightful absurdity. I turned my attention to my collection of garden gnomes, which I had amassed over the years for a project that never materialized. Don't ask. Suddenly, they became the pawns in my game of passive-aggressive one-upmanship. That's when I started plotting. My plan called for precision, stealth, and the cover of darkness, an operation worthy of a military coup, just with a touch more whimsy. I did some reconnaissance, because who doesn't take a peek at the neighbors? I noted her fitness class schedule, Monday and Wednesday at 6 a.m., book club nights, Thursdays at 7 p.m., obviously the hottest ticket in the neighborhood, and her superstitious reliance on sleeping pills to knock her out by 10 p.m. Perfect, I muttered to myself, as I dreamed of her waking up to a lawn fully taken over by gnomes, all with mischievous grins, ready to steal the spotlight and hopefully drive her into a delightful frenzy. Finally, I needed backup, and who better than my teenage nephew Timmy? Little Timmy was desperate for community service hours, because apparently helping at soup kitchens is suo last decade, and the idea of neighborhood beautification seemed to resonate with him. "Auntie, are you sure you want me to help you with this?" he asked, skepticism written all over his teenage face. "Trust me, Timmy, this is going to be legendary." "Talk about an art installation," I replied, reeling him into my mad scheme. We began our operation with gusto. The first night, we stealthily slipped one gnome onto her porch, carefully positioned next to her ostentatious flamingo statue, the one that should have been an Instagram hit but never quite became one. One gnome wasn't enough for an insufferable Karen, though. Oh no, one gnome was merely the appetizer to the main course that awaited her. And just like that, under the veil of night, the gnome war had commenced. With mischief alight in our eyes, we plotted our next strategic placement, blissfully unaware of the chaos our gnome sanctuary would unleash. What's the best way to get back at someone who takes themselves way too seriously? Let me tell you, in my neighborhood, that's easy. Gnomes. But before we dive into Operation Gnome Home, let me set the stage. Picture this. A suburban paradise where the lawns are greener than a leprechaun's dream and pastel-painted houses line the streets like a candy-colored row of happy clouds. The air fills with the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the sound of power mowers echo through the quiet evenings. But all is not as serene as it seems. Lurking beneath this cheerful facade is Marjorie, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. If you don't believe me, just ask her. Marjorie's voice, ingrained with just the right level of passive aggression, echoes in my mind. Standards must be upheld. Marjorie has the unique ability to find fault with any imaginable detail, painting the neighborhood with a monochrome brush of conformity. You could have the cutest flamingo lawn ornaments, but buckle up. She'll inform you that they clash with the earth tones of the sidewalk. The same earth tones, mind you, that she insisted upon in that torturous HOA meeting where I, against my better judgment, attempted to advocate for a little more personality around here. So when she led the charge against security cameras, claiming they were unsightly technological intrusions, it was hard not to laugh. I mean, really, what was next? A ban on doorbells for being too loud. I was tempted to remind her that my pet cat losing its muffin-shaped rear in the post office wasn't an affront to the neighborhood aesthetic. But then, I had a much better idea, a delicious way to unleash my inner prankster. Cue the gnomes. Operation Gnome Home kicked off at 11:30 p.m. on the first night. Armed with my flashlight and a singular fishing gnome, I crept into Marjorie's yard like a raccoon on a mission. I placed that little guy right by her pristine rose bush, his fishing rod and goofy grin a cheeky poke at her prudish aesthetic. Just visible enough to be spotted, but also easily dismissed as an innocent prank. Marjorie, with her wind chime voice and all, must have simply chuckled at her new gardening buddy. I fully expected her to shrug it off while sipping her herbal tea on the porch, thinking it was just a neighbor's weird sense of humor. But after a bit of surveillance, or, casually sauntering by her yard in the daytime while pretending to walk my dog, I noted there was absolutely no reaction. Not one to give up easily, I rallied my partner in crime, Lucy, my neighbor and fellow gnome enthusiast. The next night, darkness fell like a cozy blanket as we strategically planted 3 more gnomes, this time getting creative with their staging. One was marching toward the front door, another mimicked a businessman holding up an imaginary briefcase, and the last looked like he was stuck in the flower bed trying to pry himself free. We dubbed them the Gnome Squad, rallying for supremacy in Marjorie's garden. By night 5, we had planted a total of 15 gnomes. Some peeked curiously from bushes, others joyfully waved from flower beds, and one particularly brave gnome was scaling that trellis like it was Everest. I could practically hear the gnome army humming the theme song of Mission Impossible. Each day passed without a whisper of reaction from our antagonist. The stars aligned. It was perfect. How could Marjorie, the vigilant HOA general, miss a yard littered with gnomes like confetti at a parade? And with security cameras off the table, we were free to craft our whimsical masterpiece without interruption. As I trudged back to my house that night, a grin plastered on my face, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer it would take before Marjorie finally cracked. She was in for the ride of her life, and I was all in for a front row seat. Who knew a few silly gnomes could stir such delight, and how the queen of the HOA would react once her gnome-infested yard became the talk of the neighborhood. My popcorn was ready. Let the games begin. The sun was shining brightly on the 5th day of our little prank war when I sauntered out onto the porch with my morning coffee, mug cradling my hands like a warm, caffeinated hug. The sky was that postcard-perfect blue, the kind that always seemed to scream, "Go outside and partake in something that could remotely be considered a productive hobby." But instead, I was about to enter the realm of living room warriors, armed with nothing but some ingenuity and a wicked sense of humor. Marjorie lived across the street. You'd think she was the unofficial president of the Homeowners Association, given her propensity to detail every Vlastander of our neighborhood, from stray plastic bags blowing around to the exact shade of pink on her petunias that was deemed not up to snuff. Today, though, she had a different agenda in mind. I took a sip of my steaming Java, the caffeine hitting my system like a welcome punch in the gut, when I caught the immediate hint of chaos brewing across the street. That's when it happened. Marjorie barreled towards me, a box of garden gnomes hoisted like a battle flag. Inside that flimsy cardboard were her beloved gnomes. You know, those creepy little guys with painted smiles and disproportionately large hats that seemed to mock my very existence from her perfectly manicured lawn. "Is this your idea of a joke?" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the calm like a chainsaw through silk. I glanced around, half expecting someone to burst out of their house like a sitcom audience, gasping at her overdramatic flair. The noses of our neighbors were practically pressed against their glittering windows, eyes wide, lips twitching as they tried to stifle laughter. I put on my best poker face, feigning innocence. "Oh, Marjorie, gnomes are very migratory creatures, you know. Perhaps they found their way to a more appreciative environment." I punctuated my words with a smug little smile, and trust me, I was enjoying every millisecond of her frustrated disbelief. That merely stoked the fire. Her face turned a shade of crimson that could outshine even the boldest of sunsets. I shot a glance towards the ever-watchful Millie, the sweet old lady from next door, who had now exploded into fits of laughter, practically slapping her knee. Really, that's the kind of support I lived for. That night, Marjorie was off her gnome-wrangling game, clearly plotting her revenge. I strolled back to my house, a smug grin plastered across my face, only to catch a glimpse of Marjorie, drills and screws in hand, zealously installing a motion-activated spotlight. It got me thinking, who even takes such drastic measures against garden statue thievery? But my laughter faded to a simmering pot of nerves as I wondered what armed Marjorie would conjure up next. The following morning was my personal favorite. As I squinted into the sun, shamelessly sipping my coffee, I cracked open the door to a sight that sent me into hysterics. There they were, 25 of her precious gnomes, arranged in a perfect circle around her prized fountain, holding tiny picket signs reading, "Gnome Rights" and "Free the Garden." There was no turning back now. I had crossed the point of no return, and Marjorie, the scream that erupted from her lungs pierced the quiet suburban air, echoing 3 blocks away. It was a melody of chaos, one I could practically feel vibrating in my bones. Morning coffee had never tasted sweeter. Was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, let's be real, it was mostly just the worst of times. I mean, who would have thought that living in a neighborhood with a homeowners association could be this dramatic? Picture this: pastel-colored houses lined neatly in rows, perfectly manicured grass that had been cut just yesterday, and smack dab in the middle of it all, my proud little army of garden gnomes. All of them with their whimsical grins and whimsical hats, standing guard over my flower bed. I could practically hear them humming in harmony every time I watered the roses. But as glorious as my gnome display was, little did I know that it would catch the ire of the neighborhood tyrant, Marjorie. You see, Marjorie isn't just your run-of-the-mill Karen. She's a Karen with a clipboard, armed with a stack of HOA bylaws and a flair for melodrama. She lives 2 doors down, and honestly, I suspect she sleeps with her eyes wide open, just waiting for a neighbor to slip up. The day Marjorie started eyeballing my gnomes, I could practically see the gears turning in her head, plotting to save the world from lawn decoration terrorism. It all began on a Thursday afternoon when I received Marjorie's very first email titled, "Urgent." Lawn violations. My heart immediately sank. I opened it, half expecting a nuclear apocalypse, and instead found a rant about how my gnomes were distracting to passers-by and defying the community aesthetic. I chuckled at how serious she was about something that belonged in a fairy tale, but my amusement quickly washed away as I read further. "If you do not remove these grotesque eyesores, I will be forced to take action." Now here's when it starts to get juicy. She sent that email to the HOA board, and oh, did they love it. They absolutely feasted on her outrage like it was the last slice of pizza at a potluck. It was an emergency meeting she called in, and I swear I could feel the collective excitement of my neighbors, who were more than ready to share their own grievances against Marjorie's reign of terror. The meeting was incredibly dramatic. Picture a room filled with tight-lipped members sipping coffee as passive-aggressive whispers danced through the air. "I mean, have you seen her azaleas?" A neighbor leaned over to whisper. "Terrible." The colors clash. Marjorie sat at the front, a self-righteous queen with her trusty clipboard, eyes darting nervously. As the meeting progressed, one brave soul stood up. "Marjorie," she began, "since when do gnomes terrorize anyone?" "I'd argue they add character. I'm more terrified of your cat than I am of those little guys." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, each one more validating than the last. One neighbor after another joined in, echoing their disdain for her overreaching authority. It was beautiful chaos. And then, the piece de resistance, the moment of sweet comic relief, someone pointed out that the bylaws had absolutely zero mention of gnomes, or for that matter, any lawn decorations at all. The gasps from Marjorie were worth their weight in gold. The ensuing silence was deafening. There she sat, a blissfully unaware ruler slowly crumbling as embarrassment washed over her like a tidal wave. By the following week, Marjorie had resigned. I couldn't help but glimpse her avoiding eye contact during the farewell meeting, though it made me want to do a little jig. The community voted in a new board that immediately adopted more reasonable, gnome-friendly policies. My gnome army was reinstated with enthusiastic cheers. As they resumed their rightful place, I'd often hear neighbors joke about how sometimes one of my gnomes went missing. The gnome on Marjorie's lawn on the anniversary of her resignation, the perfect cherry on top of this sweet, gnome-covered cake. So there you have it, a tiny ceramic reminder that, while community rules might bind us, harmless joys should always have a place in our homes, be it through gnomes or the laughter they create.